Welcome on everybody, Tiffany here from Tiffany Gordon Cosplay with another cosplay tutorial, and this one is gonna be over how I made my Ashbringer sword from the game World of Warcraft. And here are the reference images that I went off of to make my sword. As always, I had to start off by making a 2-scale blueprint of the sword, and it is available on my website, www.tiffanygordoncosplay.com, or just see the link below. I first started off by working on the blade of the sword, which I ended up using pink insulation foam. Unfortunately, there was not large enough sheets, so I ended up having to glue 2 pieces together using hot glue. And once those 2 sheets were glued together, I then used my blueprint and traced on the blade onto the insulation foam. The next step was to cut out the blade using a box cutter. As a safety note, you need to use gloves to help protect yourself from the insulation foam. It can have an allergic reaction if it comes in contact with your skin, so I highly recommend using glass working gloves. I repeated the same process with the basket part of the sword, and for the basket I ended up using 2 pieces of insulation foam to get the thickness that I needed. And to attach those 2 pieces together, I again used hot glue. Now that all of our base pieces are cut out, it's time to tackle how to make the sword come apart in 2 pieces, so that way we can transport it. For me, I always go to my CPVC piping. It's similar to PVC, but a lot easier to work with, and I find that there's a lot better attachment pieces for it. So with this, I ended up measuring out my 2 pieces that I was gonna cut, as well as having a male and female screw-off end, so that way the hilt can detach from the blade. And then I also used a T-like shape for the bottom, and I'll explain that in a bit. Once I had my measurements done, I ended up cutting 2 pieces of the CPVC pipes using my jeweler saw, and then checked my fit before epoxying all of the pieces together. In total, there was 5 pieces that all needed to be glued. And once the pieces were glued, I ended up tracing onto the insulation foam where I needed to cut out for the CPVC pipe to fit inside. For easy cutting of this, I ended up using a hot wand, which basically is a hot knife, except it's got about a foot-long bar coming out of it, and slowly you can end up burning the insulation foam. But do be warned, if it is over hot, you can burn too much of it, and the smell is really bad, so you need to have a respirator on as well as proper ventilation. Yay, it now fits! Now let's talk about that little T-bar at the very end of the piece. The reason for this is so that way, since you have 2 pieces together, this is going to prevent the whole CPVC pipe from being pulled out of the sword blade. If it wasn't there, you could easily, even with gluing it together, it could probably come apart, and you don't want that to happen. So the T-bar actually helps to lock it inside the sword and not come loose. And for extra security, I ended up using tons and tons of hot glue to cover all of the holes on both sides of this CPVC pipe insulation glue together thing. And to make sure that it fit more flush with the insulation foam, I ended up adding a piece of 2mm EVA foam, so that way it was gonna make a much nicer flat surface for the rest of the processes after this. Now that that whole part is taken care of, let's talk about how I ended up giving shape to the blade. Of course, I used my blueprint again as guidelines to help me know where I needed to do all of my sanding lines, as well as I went around with a Sharpie around the side so I knew where to do all of my sanding to the center point. I then, with the help of my glass working gloves, used a box cutter to carve out a little bit of the insulation foam. This will make it so it's a lot less dusty for the sanding process. And then went to my workbench and used a 2-inch long sanding drum to sand all of my edges flat. Side note though, insulation foam when sanded using a Dremel with a sanding drum, it will kind of melt onto the sanding drum, And so it's something to be aware of because your sandpaper then is not really usable. Then to cover the insulation foam, I ended up cutting out the main shape of the blade using 2mm EVA foam that I then heat treated using a heat gun and followed up by attaching it with wood glue. Do not use contact cement glue on insulation foam because the glue ends up melting and burning out the insulation foam and leaving tons of craters and holes. And if you want a flat surface, this is not the right method for it. When using wood glue, it takes longer to dry, but it works just about the same. And here's what it looks like after it's attached. For the main detail part of the blade, I ended up using 4mm EVA foam that I traced using a silver Sharpie and then cut out all of the details using an X-Acto knife. And to get more of a nice rounded edge on some of the smaller parts that I cut out, I went back with a hot knife and burned and kind of fused all of those pieces back together. Next, I heat treated the piece using a heat gun again, and for attaching the EVA foam to EVA foam, I ended up using contact cement glue, trying to avoid any of the glue running off onto the insulation foam. Once again, I used a box cutter to then carve my edges, and back to the workbench to sand. All sanding with insulation foam, I highly recommend using glass wearing gloves as well as long sleeves because all of the sanding bits of the insulation foam will end up landing on your skin and you could have an allergic reaction. You also will want to be wearing a respirator because you do not want to breathe in any of these little insulation foam particles. For all of the outer edge pieces, I ended up using 2mm EVA foam that I cut, heat treated, and just on the EVA foam parts, I added contact cement glue, and then on the insulation foam parts, I used wood glue, and then attached the two pieces together. And then used an X-Acto knife to cut off any of the extra EVA foam pieces. And here is what the blade looks like so far. Once again, back to the workbench to sand now the EVA foam. And then for adding any of the nooks and cracks into the sword, I ended up tracing it where I want it to go with a Sharpie, used a box cutter to trim out that little piece, and then recovered it with EVA foam. For the little circle details that are next to the basket on the blade, I ended up using 4mm EVA foam and 2mm EVA foam that I cut using an X-Acto blade, heat treated, and then glued to the blade with contact cement glue. Now let's talk about the basket part of the sword. This piece is 2 pieces of insulation foam glued together with hot glue. And of course, cutting them, they weren't even, so I ended up having to sand both pieces flush with a sanding drum and all the same safety gear that I've been recommending this whole time. Next, I traced the insulation foam basket part onto 2mm EVA foam using a silver Sharpie and repeated the same, cutting with an X-Acto knife, heat treating with a heat gun, and then gluing the pieces of EVA foam to insulation foam using wood glue processes, as well as covering the outside parts with contact cement glue just for the EVA foam part and wood glue for the center insulation foam part. And here's what the piece looks like once it is fully covered in the 2mm EVA foam. I then went back to my workbench and sanded all of the edges using a sanding drum, and then added a battle-like damage to all of the piece using a sanding disc. Next, I ended up cutting 10mm EVA foam out to cover the whole outer side of the basket and glued it together using contact cement glue. And this is what it looks like once all of the 10mm EVA foam is attached. I followed up by rounding all of the outer sides using a sanding drum, as well as rounding the top part, so that way there was no sharp edges anywhere. And of course, I had to add more battle damage to this using a sanding disc as well. A little side note, when working with EVA foam, you do want to dust off all of your pieces once you're done sanding. There is a lot of EVA foam dust left on your piece, and if you are to prime or paint this dust will end up causing problems for your paint or primer to stick to the EVA foam and will cause chipping. And then the final step for this part was to heat treat the whole piece lightly. Make sure not to overheat because if it happens to go to the insulation foam that's inside, it will melt. For attaching the basket part to the sword part, I ended up tracing where the CPVC pipe went through both these pieces and cut out this piece using a heat wand. I also ended up having to trim a little bit of the basket part so that way the sword would fit up flush. To attach both the pieces together, I ended up applying contact cement glue to both pieces and letting them fully dry before attaching together. And here is what the pieces look like when they are attached. I did have a little bit of separation with my EVA foam for connecting the pieces, so I ended up using foam clay to fill all of those places together. This is the process of applying water to the surface of your piece and then applying the foam clay with your finger into the crack or the hole and then using more water to smooth out as flush as possible. Now that our foam parts are done of the sword, let's talk about the floating hand thing of the sword. I did my base lines in Adobe Illustrator and then imported them into a 3D modeling program called Rhino 6, where I ended up making the two sides of the hand as well as the ring. And then I also made parts for attaching the clear acrylic rods, and we'll get to that in just a second. Once I was happy with the CAD, I then printed each of the three pieces on my Prusa i3 Mark 2.5 3D printer in ABS filament. And when all the pieces were done being printed, I attached the three pieces together using epoxy. Now, to give the floating illusion of this handpiece to the sword, I used clear acrylic rods, which I ended up sanding first and then using epoxy to glue them inside the handpiece. And while that dried, I worked on the handle part, which I ended up making into two separate pieces just because of height limitations on my 3D printer, and did the same process of printing and removing all of the support structures. And then I ended up sanding the 3D printed parts using a buffing wheel. This kind of helps to melt some of the loose particles of the 3D printed materials together, as well as remove the stair step of the look on the 3D printing pieces. For attaching the handle to the sword part, I first made sure my CPVC pipe was fully tight to the blade, and then I ended up covering the EVA foam part with masking tape so that way our epoxy does not glue to that piece, and then put both pieces onto the pipe to attach together. And for the battle damage for the handle, I again used a sanding disc. For further removal of the stair step texture on the 3D printed parts and to make the pieces smoother, I ended up doing a coat of sandable spray paint onto both the hand and the handle. And once it was dry, I then sanded it flush with 220 grit sandpaper. And here are all of the pieces so far. Unfortunately, at this part, my hot wand broke on me, so all I had was a hot knife, which wasn't quite long enough. So I kind of had to make a few things work. So using my hot knife, I ended up burning out the holes where the clear acrylic rods would be inserted into the sword blade. And for attaching the clear acrylic rods to the blade, I ended up using epoxy again. Once the epoxy was fully dry, I ended up filling all of the holes using foam clay. Please note that foam clay does take normally around 12 to 24 hours to fully dry, depending on how thick your foam clay is. So just be prepared if you're still having to do steps after this. And here is all of the pieces all together now. To prep for painting, I ended up covering all the clear acrylic rods using masking tape, and then sprayed all of the pieces with 3 heavy coats of Plasti-Dip. Now normally I don't use Plastidip on my 3D printed parts, but I wanted it to have the same texture as the rest of the sword. And in the end, it actually ends up turning out better than I was hoping and will be my go-to method for now on. Once all of the Plastidip was dry, I then went and did a base coat of white Testors airbrush paint onto all of the pieces that we're gonna paint yellow. And then did a mixture of yellow and gold airbrush paint onto those pieces. And to add a little bit more depth, I ended up going back with a little bit more of an orange hue in certain spots. For the hand part, of course I started off with the yellow airbrush paint as shown, but then I went in with a bright orange around all of the dark pieces, and then did a light color of a yellow-white color on top, followed by a white highlighted section on the far right. And once all of these pieces were dry, I then masked them off using a combination of masking tape and pieces of paper. For the basket part and parts of the hilt, I ended up doing a base coat of red airbrush paint followed by a mixture of a red and copper color to give a little bit more age in certain spots. And once again, masked off those pieces. For the texture part of the handle, I started off with a base coat of white airbrush paint, followed by a cream color, and then in all of the crevices, I did a mocha color, followed by a little bit of black airbrush paint just to give it a little more depth. And now for the blade part. I first started off by recovering the whole surface with black airbrush paint. The reason being is there was a little bit of spray from all of our other colors before, and I wanted it to all be one solid color, so that way we could build up our layers from that. I then proceeded by starting off with a base coat of a gray-silver mix of airbrush paint, followed by going in with a dark gray into certain areas and a little bit of black into some shadowing, and then on the far right image I ended up going in with a very, very light gray-silver area, so that way there would be some highlights and it would look a little bit more like the actual in-game Ashbringer sword. And once all of those pieces were dry, I removed most of all the masked off areas and then went back in with black airbrush paint to add in a little bit more shadows and depths and really bring this piece to life. And the last part of the painting was to go back by hand and use the black Testors airbrush paint and kind of add a little bit more to all of the battle damage areas. And all that's left now was to really just seal the whole sword using a coat of satin clear enamel spray paint. And then my Ashbringer sword from the game World of Warcraft was done. Thank you guys so much for watching this cosplay tutorial, and I hope you enjoyed it. If so, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and to follow me on all of my social medias, and as well leave a comment and let me know what you think of the final sword. Thanks guys, much love!